In 1986, a man named Fluky Stokes was buried on the south side of Chicago in a mahogany casket, dressed in a blue silk suit and blue python skin shoes, with a portable telephone resting on his chest. 2 years earlier, he had buried his own son in a coffin built to look like a Cadillac, with working headlights and cash tucked between the boy's fingers. Thousands of people lined up to file past him. Mothers lifted their children over the casket to get a look. They were not mourning a politician or a preacher. They were mourning a drug kingpin. That contradiction sits at the heart of this entire story. Chicago has produced some of the most powerful, feared, and strangely beloved criminals in American history, and almost everything most people think they know about them is only half the picture. What follows is a walk through 10 of them, 10 real, documented figures who built empires in this city, and the very different ways each one finally fell. Section 1. Al Capone, the boss who built the outfit. To understand crime in Chicago, you have to start with the man whose name still stands in for the whole idea of an American crime boss. Almost 100 years later, when most people picture a gangster in a sharp suit and a wide hat, they are really picturing him. He was the blueprint. Everyone who came after, in this city and far beyond it, was in some way following a path he walked first. His full name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899 into a family of Italian immigrants. He was not born into crime. His parents were ordinary working people who had crossed an ocean for a better life. But the neighborhood around him was rough, and as a teenager he drifted toward the local crews that ran the streets. He joined a New York outfit known as the 5 Points Gang, and he took early jobs as a bouncer for vice businesses connected to organized crime. Somewhere in those years, during a fight, he was cut across the cheek. The mark never fully faded, and it handed him the nickname the public would remember forever, Scarface. He could not stand it. He preferred that friends call him Snorky, an old slang word that meant something close to sharp dresser. The newspapers used Scarface anyway, and it stuck for good. Around 1920, Capone got an invitation that changed his life. A man named Johnny Torrio, who had known him back in New York, asked him to come west to Chicago. Torrio was a lieutenant in a powerful local operation run by a figure called Big Jim Colosimo. When Colosimo's life ended in 1920, Torrio rose to the top, and Capone rose right alongside him as his trusted second. At first, Capone was a bodyguard and a driver, but Torrio could see the young man was smart, careful, and willing to do whatever the job required. He pulled him in close. The timing could not have been more perfect for men like them. In 1920, the United States had banned the making and selling of alcohol across the entire country. This period was called Prohibition, and it lasted until 1933. The idea behind it was to make society healthier and calmer. What it actually did was hand a giant, ready-made business to criminals. Ordinary people still wanted to drink. The law said they could not buy it legally. So an enormous black market appeared overnight, and whoever could supply that demand stood to become incredibly rich. Torrio and Capone understood this faster and better than almost anyone else. They built a supply chain for illegal alcohol, opened secret bars known as speakeasies, and ran gambling rooms on the side. Money poured in by the truckload. In 1925, an attempt was made on Torrio's life. He was badly hurt, and after he recovered, he decided he had seen enough. He stepped back and retired to New York, handing the whole operation to Capone. Just like that, at only 26 years old, Al Capone became the boss of what became known simply as the Outfit. For the next several years, he ran one of the most profitable criminal empires the country had ever seen. He set up his headquarters in a Chicago hotel called the Lexington. He took control of the nearby town of Cicero almost like it was his own private kingdom, and he kept the whole machine running smoothly by paying off the people who were supposed to stop him: police officers, city officials, judges, politicians. A steady river of cash kept many of them looking the other way. But Capone did not only run a business, he fought a war. Chicago in the 1920s was carved up between rival crews, and they did not share territory politely. They fought over routes, customers, and respect, and that fighting often turned deadly. The most famous example happened on February the 14th, 1929, an event the world came to call the St. Valentine's Day attack. 7 men connected to a rival crew led by a competitor known as Bugs Moran lost their lives inside a garage on the city's north side. They were lined up against a wall by attackers, some of whom were dressed as police officers, which is why the victims did not run. The job was widely blamed on Capone's organization, even though Capone himself was hundreds of miles away at his home in Florida at the time, with a clean alibi ready. He was never charged for it, but that single morning changed everything for him. Here is the part that many people miss. The attack made Capone famous, but fame was the worst thing that could have happened to him. Up to that point, he had been a Chicago problem, handled or ignored by local authorities he could influence. After that morning, his name was in newspapers across the entire nation. He became a symbol of how lawless the country had gotten. The pressure stopped being local and became federal. The government in Washington decided that this man had to be brought down, no matter what it took. By 1930, he sat at the very top of the federal most wanted list. The trouble was that catching him was almost impossible using the obvious crimes. Witnesses were too frightened to talk. Evidence vanished. Anyone who might testify against him understood exactly what that choice could cost them. The famous team of federal agents led by Eliot Ness, nicknamed the Untouchables because they could not be bribed, did real damage by smashing Capone's alcohol operations and cutting into his profits. But raiding warehouses was not the same as putting the boss behind bars. The outfit lost product. Capone stayed free. So the government tried a different door, and it turned out to be the one that worked. Instead of trying to prove the violent crimes, they went after his money. A senior official had years earlier pioneered a clever idea. If a known criminal was obviously living like a millionaire, but had never paid taxes on a single dollar, you could convict him for tax evasion. You did not have to prove how he earned the money. You only had to prove he had it, and never paid what he owed on it. For a man like Capone, who spent enormous sums but kept almost nothing in his own name and avoided bank accounts, this was a real threat. The Treasury Department put its financial agents to work, quietly building the case dollar by dollar. They got their first win against his older brother Ralph, who was tried for tax evasion in 1930 and sent away for 18 months. That should have been a warning. Then came a fateful mistake. Trying to clean up his tax situation, Capone let his own lawyer send a letter to the government discussing how much income he was willing to pay tax on. In that letter, the lawyer admitted very large yearly earnings, around $100,000 for some years. In other words, without any raid or search, the government now had a written admission from Capone's own side that he had earned a fortune and paid nothing. It was a gift, and the prosecutors took it. When the case went forward, the evidence painted a picture using nothing but spending. The government read into the record how Capone lived, thousands of dollars on custom suits, tens of thousands on furniture. A grand estate in Florida bought and improved with huge sums of cash, including a swimming pool that alone cost a small fortune for the time. A specially built automobile worth far more than most families earned in years. Even his phone bill ran into thousands of dollars. There were also donations on the books, money sent to a church and to a fund for the widows of officers, which showed just how freely the cash moved. None of it had been taxed. Laid out together, it was overwhelming. Before the trial truly began, Capone tried to take a shortcut. In June of 1931, he pleaded guilty, believing his lawyers had arranged a deal for a short, comfortable sentence of about 2.5 years. He even bragged about it to reporters. But the judge, James Wilkerson, made something very clear. No private deal was going to tie his hands. When Capone realized the judge would not honor the bargain, he took back his guilty plea and chose to fight it out in court instead. It was a gamble, and it failed. The trial itself had moments that almost felt like theater. Capone's defense tried to argue that he was not really rolling in money, because he lost so much betting on horse races. They brought in people to testify that he had lost more than $200,000 at the track over a few years. The problem was that not one of those witnesses could name a single time he had ever won. A famous newspaper writer joked that Capone might just be the worst horse gambler in the entire world. The strategy backfired completely, because losing that much money only proved he had that much money to lose in the first place. In October of 1931, the jury reached its decision. Al Capone was found guilty of tax evasion. The sentence landed hard: 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, nearly $8,000 more in court costs, and a bill of $215,000 in back taxes on top of it. The most feared crime boss in America had been brought down not by a raid, not by a witness, not by the violence everyone associated with him, but by paperwork and arithmetic. He reportedly told his lawyers that he guessed it was all over, and that they had done all they could. He began his sentence at a federal prison in Atlanta, but there were complaints that he was getting special treatment and quietly pulling strings even from inside, so the government moved him to its toughest, most isolated prison of all, the island fortress of Alcatraz, sitting in the cold water off San Francisco. There, cut off from his network and his money, his power simply drained away. He served his time, paid what he owed, and was finally released in November of 1939, after roughly 7.5 years behind bars. By then, he was not the same man. A long-term illness he had carried for years had badly damaged his mind, and doctors found his thinking had slipped to that of a much younger, confused person. The brilliant strategist who had once run a city was gone. He lived out his final years quietly at his estate in Florida, watched over by his family, and passed away in 1947. So what is the real lesson of Al Capone? The one that matters for everything that follows in this city's story. It is not that crime does not pay, because for years it paid him extraordinarily well. The real lesson is sharper and stranger than that. Capone fell because he became a celebrity. He loved the cameras, the headlines, the image of the larger-than-life boss. That visibility made him a national target, and once the full weight of the federal government turned toward a single man, no amount of bribery or fear could hold it back forever. He was not undone by a rival or by a bullet. He was undone by attention, and by a paper trail he was too proud and too careless to hide. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That single idea would echo through Chicago's underworld for the rest of the century. The men who took over the outfit after him studied his rise and his fall like a textbook, and the most important of them learned the opposite lesson completely. He decided that the smartest boss is the one nobody ever notices, the one whose name never makes the front page. He would run the very same organization for decades, and in all that time he would barely spend a single night behind bars. Section 2. Tony Accardo, the boss who was never caught. If Al Capone is the loudest name in Chicago's underworld, then Tony Accardo is the most important name almost nobody outside the city knows. That gap is not an accident. It is the whole point of him. Capone wanted the spotlight, and it destroyed him. Accardo wanted the shadows, and the shadows kept him safe for nearly half a century. He took the exact same organization Capone built, ran it for far longer, made it far richer, and walked away at the end of his life a free man who died of old age in his own bed. To understand how that is even possible, you have to understand a man who treated being forgotten as his greatest weapon. His birth name was Antonino Leonardo Accardo. He was born in Chicago in 1906. The son of a shoemaker who had come to America from a town in Sicily. The family settled in a poor, crowded immigrant neighborhood, and like a lot of boys in that world, young Antonino found the streets more interesting than the classroom. He left school at 14 and started hanging around the local pool halls, drifting into one of the many small street gangs that fed talent up into the bigger criminal world of the city. Think of those gangs almost like a training ground. The adult bosses watched them, picked out the ones with promise, and recruited the best. One of Capone's most dangerous men spotted Accardo and pulled him in. That was his way into the outfit. 2 nicknames followed him for the rest of his life, and both tell you something. The first was Joe Batters. The story behind it is grim but worth understanding, because it explains the respect he commanded so early. Accardo was said to have handled a violent job for the organization using a baseball bat, dealing with men who had betrayed the group. When Capone heard how the work was done, he supposedly remarked that this kid was a real Joe Batters. The name was meant as high praise in that world. It marked Accardo as someone who could be trusted with the ugliest tasks and would not flinch. The second nickname came much later and was far more harmless. In 1939, on a fishing trip up in Canada, he reeled in a giant tuna weighing around 400 pounds and got photographed standing proudly beside it. Chicago newspapers started calling him Big Tuna. He hated it, but it stuck. In his early years, he was muscle. He worked as a bodyguard and a driver, sitting for hours in hotel lobbies, screening the people who wanted to see the boss. He built a reputation as someone fiercely loyal and completely reliable. There have always been rumors that he was connected to the famous St. Valentine's Day attack of 1929, the morning when 7 men from a rival crew lost their lives. Most serious historians believe his actual involvement was small or non-existent, and he was never charged. But the rumor alone added to the fearsome shine around his name, and in that world, reputation was currency. What truly set Accardo apart was not his strength. Plenty of men in the outfit were strong and willing to do violence. What set him apart was his patience and his brain. He watched what happened to the people above him, and he learned from every single one of their mistakes. After Capone went to prison in 1931, the leadership of the outfit passed through a series of hands. One boss, Frank Nitti, faced his own serious legal trouble, and his life ended in 1943. Another powerful figure, Paul Ricca, took over, but was soon locked up himself. And here is the lucky break that shaped Accardo's whole future. Ricca trusted him completely and, before going away to prison, named Accardo as his second in command. So by the mid-1940s, with Ricca behind bars, Tony Accardo found himself running the day-to-day operations of the entire Chicago outfit. He was still only in his late 30s. What he did with that power is the reason he matters. The bosses before him were creatures of the Prohibition era. Their whole world had been built on illegal alcohol and on muscle. But Accardo understood that the world had changed, and the organization had to change with it. He pulled the outfit out of some of the riskiest, most exposed rackets, the kind that had sent his predecessors to prison, and he pushed it toward operations that were quieter, more reliable, and harder to prosecute. He moved heavily into gambling, and he did it in a clever way. He took control of the wire services that carried horse racing information, because whoever controlled that information controlled the bookmakers across the city. Bookies needed those results to set odds and pay out bets, and Accardo made sure the flow ran through him. He went further. He moved the outfit into slot machines and vending machines, and rather than just placing them around, he invested in the companies that actually manufactured the machines. Then he made sure those machines turned up in gas stations, restaurants, and bars all over the region. He expanded into counterfeiting tax stamps for cigarettes and alcohol. He pushed the organization's reach into places far outside Chicago, into states most people would never associate with the outfit at all. And most famously, he understood early what was happening in the desert of Nevada. As Las Vegas exploded into a gambling capital, Accardo and the outfit established hidden financial interests in its casinos, quietly taking a cut of the enormous sums of cash flowing through them, a practice known as skimming. Money that was supposed to be counted and reported instead disappeared into the organization's pockets before it ever hit the books. Under his leadership, the outfit did not just survive, it grew enormously wealthy and more sophisticated than ever. One of his old partners reportedly said that Accardo had more brains for breakfast than Capone had in his whole life. That might sound like an exaggeration, but the results back it up. There is a reason many historians of organized crime consider Accardo the single most powerful figure in the American underworld of the 20th century. New York had a famously large crime scene, but it was split among 5 competing families. Chicago, for all practical purposes, had one organization and one ultimate authority. And for decades, that authority was him. Now here is the achievement that almost defies belief, and it is the heart of why his story is so different from Capone's. Tony Accardo was arrested more than 30 times across his life. He was investigated again and again. He was hauled in front of grand juries and committees that demanded he explain himself. And in all of that, across a criminal career that stretched for the better part of 60 years, he spent at most a single night in jail. He bragged about it openly. He was never convicted of any serious crime. He died a free man. So how on earth did he manage that, when Capone, with all his money and power, fell so completely? The answer comes down to a handful of deliberate choices that he stuck to with iron discipline. The first was simple but hard to follow: stay invisible. Accardo watched Capone court the cameras, and he watched it end in disaster. He decided to do the exact opposite. He lived quietly. For most of his life, he was a faithful husband who preferred a calm evening at home with his wife to wild nights out on the town. He did not chase headlines. He did not perform for the public. He understood that attention itself was the danger, that the moment a boss becomes famous, he becomes a target the government cannot ignore. So he made himself boring on purpose, and boring kept him free. The second choice was about distance. Accardo built the outfit so that the orders came from the top, but the dirty work happened far below, through layers of people. He did not pull triggers or carry packages himself. He set the direction, and others carried it out, and between him and any actual crime there were so many layers that no single person could connect him to it. When investigators questioned lower-level members, they often found that those members simply did not know enough to bring down the man at the top. Each person knew only their own small piece. That structure, where information is broken into pieces and no one can see the whole picture, made the organization incredibly hard to take apart. You could arrest a soldier, but the soldier could not give you the boss, because the soldier had never been told anything that mattered. The third choice was to make the money look clean. Accardo built a web of legitimate businesses, real companies that genuinely operated, and he ran his hidden wealth through them. On paper, he could point to legal sources of income, which made it far harder for anyone to do to him what they had done to Capone, who got convicted purely because his lavish spending had no legal explanation. Accardo learned that exact lesson. If you give the money a believable story, the tax trap becomes much weaker. This discipline did not mean he was gentle. Far from it. The fear around his name was very real, and the organization under him dealt harshly with betrayal. There is a chilling example from his own home. When the architect who designed his mansion later handed the building's blueprints over to federal agents, that man vanished and was never found again. Crossing Accardo, or the organization he led, was understood to be one of the most dangerous things a person could do in the city. His power rested on both the carrot and the stick, the steady money that kept everyone loyal, and the certainty of consequences for anyone who broke that loyalty. There is one more chapter that shows just how feared he remained even late in life, and it became one of the most famous stories in Chicago crime history. In December of 1977, a crew of burglars made an almost unbelievable decision. They broke into Tony Accardo's home and robbed it. Whatever their reason, it was a fatal error in judgment. Accardo took it as a direct insult and a challenge to his authority. According to federal prosecutors who laid all of this out in court years later, the men believed responsible for that burglary were hunted down across the city one by one in the months that followed, and their lives came to violent ends. The message was unmistakable. You did not steal from the man at the top of the outfit and simply walk away. Decades later, this entire chain of events became part of a major federal investigation and trial known as Operation Family Secrets, which finally pulled back the curtain on many of the organization's oldest secrets, long after Accardo himself was gone. For a long stretch, Accardo officially stepped back from being the day-to-day boss. He took on the role of a senior advisor, a position sometimes described in these organizations as the power behind the throne. He handed the visible top job to a flashier man, but everyone who understood the real structure knew that nothing major happened without Accardo's blessing. He could fly into Chicago, sit at a meeting to settle a dispute, and fly back out to his later home in the warm comfort of Palm Springs, California. His personal holdings by then read like the portfolio of a wealthy, legitimate businessman. Office buildings, shopping centers, hotels, car dealerships, trucking companies, restaurants. The boy from the poor immigrant neighborhood had become rich in a way that looked, on the surface, entirely respectable. Tony Accardo died on May the 22nd, 1992, at the age of 86, of heart and breathing problems. There was no dramatic ending, no betrayal, no prison cell. After running or guiding the most powerful crime organization in America for nearly half a century, he simply grew old and passed away as a free man. He was buried in a quiet cemetery outside the city. Even some of the law enforcement agents who had spent their careers chasing him admitted a strange, grudging respect for the man, because by the standards of his own world, he had achieved something no one else really had. He had played the most dangerous game imaginable, at the highest level, for longer than almost anyone, and he had won. He was, as more than one observer called him, the genuine godfather. So when you put Capone and Accardo side by side, you start to see the real shape of how power worked in this city. Capone is the fireworks, brilliant, explosive, unforgettable, and gone in a flash. Accardo is the foundation, patient, hidden, and built to last. The two of them together teach the central lesson of the Chicago underworld in the 20th century, which is that the bosses who lasted were almost never the ones whose names you knew. The ones who lasted were the ones who made sure you never learned their names at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there was one boss in the outfit who refused to learn that lesson. He sat at the very top of the same organization, and instead of hiding, he did the unthinkable. He chased fame. He ran with movie stars and singers, and he got tangled up in one of the strangest secret schemes in American history, a plot that reached all the way to the highest levels of the United States government. His name was Sam Giancana, and his hunger for the spotlight would end with him lying dead on the floor of his own basement. Section 3. Sam Giancana, the boss who loved the spotlight Tony Accardo, built his entire survival on one rule: never be seen. The next man to run the outfit broke that rule on purpose, again and again, and it ended up costing him everything. Sam Giancana wanted to be famous. He wanted to be photographed with movie stars and singers. He wanted people to know exactly who he was and exactly how powerful he had become. And for a while, that hunger carried him to the very top of the organization and into the strangest secret operation in American history. But the same hunger made him a liability to the careful men around him, and in the end it left him lying on the floor of his own basement, his story unfinished and his secrets buried with him. He was born in Chicago in 1908, the son of Sicilian immigrants who had come through New York and settled on the rough west side of the city. There is even a little confusion about his exact birthday. Some records say late May, others say the middle of June, and he himself liked to celebrate it in June. His given name at birth was Guillermo, though everyone came to know him as Sam, and over the years he picked up the nicknames Momo and Mooney. He grew up in a hard, poor neighborhood, and like so many of the men in this story, he found his way into crime as a teenager. He joined a notoriously violent young street crew known as the 42 Gang, a group that ran wild on the west side doing low-level jobs and quickly building a reputation for being reckless and dangerous. That reputation got him noticed by the bigger organization. Giancana became a wheelman, which simply means a getaway driver, for the Capone operation during the height of the Prohibition years. He drove for serious men, including some of the most feared figures in the outfit, and he proved himself useful and willing. He was arrested for the first time as a young man for stealing a car, and over the years he built up a long record. He had a talent for staying alive and moving up in a world where most people did neither. During the Second World War, Giancana avoided being drafted into the military in a way that says a lot about how the authorities saw him. A government examiner looked him over and judged him to have the makeup of a hardened criminal, someone unfit and unstable, and so he was passed over for service. He spent the war years back home making money in his own way, including by producing fake ration stamps. Rationing meant that ordinary goods were limited and controlled during the war, and a counterfeit stamp could be sold to desperate people for a high price. It was exactly the kind of scheme that turned a shortage into a fortune, and Giancana had a sharp eye for that sort of thing. He also spent time behind bars during those years, and that time turned out to be one of the most important things that ever happened to his career. In prison, he met a man named Eddie Jones, who ran illegal gambling operations in the black communities of Chicago. Jones told Giancana all about how those rackets worked, the daily numbers games and the steady streams of cash they produced. Giancana absorbed every detail. When he got out, that knowledge helped the outfit move in and take control of those gambling operations, and it helped Giancana personally rise in the organization. He had learned that information itself was a kind of treasure. By the 1950s, he had climbed high enough to take the top job. When Tony Accardo stepped back from running things day to day, Giancana moved into the boss position, taking control around 1956 and 1957. Under him, the Chicago organization kept its grip on gambling, on illegal businesses across the city, and on the flow of money that came with all of it. He told a federal agent at one point that he owned not just Chicago but other cities too, a boast that showed exactly how big he thought he was. And that boastfulness, that need to be seen as the biggest man in the room, was the seed of his downfall. Here is where Giancana's story takes a turn that almost sounds made up, except that it is fully documented in declassified government records. During this period, the United States government was deeply worried about the new leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro, who had taken power in 1959 and had pushed American interests, including organized crime's profitable casinos, out of the island. The Central Intelligence Agency, the nation's spy organization, wanted Castro gone. And in one of the most bizarre decisions in the history of American intelligence, the agency decided to ask the criminal underworld for help. The reasoning was cold and simple. The criminal organizations had lost a fortune when they were thrown out of Cuba, so they had their own reasons to want Castro removed, and they had the kind of people who could try to do it quietly. So the CIA reached out, through a middleman, to figures in the underworld. Sam Giancana was one of the men brought into this plot, alongside another powerful boss named Santo Trafficante Jr. A West Coast associate connected to Chicago helped serve as the link between the spies and the criminals. The plan that was discussed involved trying to slip poison to Castro through people who had access to him. There were attempts, they failed. According to the records that came out later, the men involved did not even take payment for the job. Giancana reportedly said something that captured the whole strange situation perfectly, that the spy agency and the criminal underworld were really just two sides of the same coin. His own daughter later claimed her father saw the whole thing partly as a scheme to pocket money and influence from the government. Whatever his real motives were, the simple fact remains astonishing. A Chicago crime boss was secretly working with the United States government on a plot to remove a foreign head of state. Giancana's connections did not stop with the spy agency. His name became tangled up with the highest levels of American politics. There are long-standing claims, debated to this day, that the criminal organizations helped John F. Kennedy win the very close presidential election of 1960, particularly through their influence in Chicago. There are also well-documented links between Giancana's social world and Kennedy's, including a woman named Judith Campbell who was connected to both men at the same time and who claimed to have carried messages between them. None of this can be proven with total certainty, and much of it lives in the murky space between fact and rumor. But the connections were real enough and close enough that they have fueled questions and theories for more than half a century. All of this fame and all of these connections came at a price, and the price was attention. The very thing Accardo had warned against, Giancana embraced. He dated a famous singer from a popular musical group. He was seen out with celebrities and entertainers. He lived large and loud and let the world watch. And the more visible he became, the more the government focused on him. Federal agents tailed his car around the city constantly. They planted listening devices in the lounge that served as his headquarters. He became one of the most watched men in America, and that heat did not just fall on him. It fell on the entire organization, which was exactly the kind of exposure the careful older bosses despised. In 1965, Giancana refused to answer questions in front of a grand jury investigating organized crime, and for that refusal he was sent to jail for a year on a contempt charge. While he was locked up, the patience of the people above him and around him ran out. The organization had grown tired of a boss who attracted so much publicity and brought so much pressure down on everyone. After his release in 1966, his control of the outfit was taken away from him. The flashy boss who had run the most powerful crime organization in America was pushed aside by the very men who valued silence over fame. Giancana left the country and settled in Mexico, in a town near Mexico City, where he lived for several years and got involved in business ventures abroad. But even in exile, he could not stay out of trouble or out of sight. In 1974, Mexican authorities detained him and forced him out of the country, sending him back to the United States. He returned to his home in Oak Park, a suburb just outside Chicago, an aging man whose days of real power were behind him, but whose head was still full of secrets. And that was the problem. By 1975, the United States Senate had launched a major investigation into the activities of the nation's intelligence agencies, including the long-hidden plots to remove foreign leaders. This investigation, run by a committee that became known by the name of the senator who led it, wanted to hear from people who had been involved. Sam Giancana, who had sat right in the middle of the CIA's scheme against Castro, was exactly the kind of witness they wanted to question. He was scheduled to talk to them. He knew where many bodies were buried, both in the literal sense and in the sense of dangerous secrets, and a man like that, facing questions under oath, was a frightening thing to the people who shared those secrets. He never got the chance to testify. On the night of June 19, 1975, Giancana was at his Oak Park home. He had recently had surgery and was recovering. Police had been keeping an eye on his house, but at some point that evening, a visitor came in through a back entrance leading down to his basement. Giancana, who was apparently comfortable with whoever it was casually cooking a small late-night meal of sausage and peppers on the stove. He had his back turned, and then, in a matter of seconds, his life was ended. He was struck multiple times by a small-caliber firearm, with the wounds clustered in a tight, deliberate pattern around his head and neck. His caretaker found him on the basement floor around 11 that night. He was 67 years old. The way it was done told investigators almost everything and nothing at the same time. The pattern of the attack, the silenced approach, the fact that he was relaxed and cooking for his guest, all pointed to someone he knew and trusted, carried out in the cold, professional style of an underworld removal. But who actually did it and on whose orders has never been officially answered. No one was ever charged. The case remains unsolved to this day. That has left the door wide open for theories, and there are many. Some believe the order came from the top of the outfit itself, from the careful older bosses who could not risk what Giancana might say to the Senate. The leading suspects in that version include the very men who had pushed him out, and even, in some accounts, Tony Accardo, who had the authority to approve such a thing. One longtime suspect was Giancana's own trusted driver and close confidant, a man who had been with him that very night, left the house, and may have returned. Others have pointed at darker possibilities, suggesting the intelligence agency wanted him quieted before he could speak about the Castro plot, though most serious researchers consider that theory long on imagination and short on evidence. The director of the spy agency at the time flatly denied any involvement. A year later, another underworld figure connected to the same Castro scheme also had his life ended, which only deepened the suspicions and the speculation. When you set Giancana against the two bosses who came before him, the lesson lands hard. Capone fell because his fame made him a national target. Accardo survived because he made himself invisible. And Giancana, who had every chance to follow Accardo's quiet example, chose Capone's path instead. He wanted the cameras, the celebrities, the recognition. That hunger took him to the very top and into rooms where the fate of nations was discussed. But it also made him too loud, too exposed, and finally too dangerous to the people around him. The same spotlight that made him a legend made him a problem, and in his world, problems did not get solved gently. His story is the end of an era in one sense. The great age of the Italian organized crime bosses, the men whose roots ran back to Capone and Prohibition, was beginning to fade. The outfit would carry on for decades more, quieter and more careful, but the legendary, larger-than-life figures who had defined Chicago crime for half a century were passing into history one by one. Something new was rising to take their place, and it was being born somewhere the outfit had never truly controlled. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because while these Italian bosses were running the rackets downtown and in the suburbs, an entirely different kind of organization was forming in the segregated neighborhoods of the South Side. It was not built by immigrants from Sicily. It was built by young black men who had come north from the Deep South looking for a better life and found a city that pushed them into a corner. Out of that pressure, one teenager would start something that began as a small neighborhood crew and grew into one of the largest street organizations the country had ever seen. They called him King David. Section 4. David Barksdale. The birth of King David. While the Italian bosses were running their rackets across Chicago, a completely different kind of organization was taking shape on the South Side, in a world the outfit never really touched. It did not grow out of prohibition or smuggled alcohol. It grew out of poverty, segregation, and the hard reality faced by black families who had come north hoping for something better. At the center of that story is a young man who started with almost nothing and built a name so large that people still speak it with reverence half a century after his death. He was born Donice David Barksdale, but the streets of Chicago came to know him simply as King David. His beginnings were about as far from a throne as you can imagine. He was born in 1947 in a small town in Mississippi, the 10th of 13 children in a sharecropping family. Sharecropping was a brutal system left over from the era after slavery, where black families worked land they did not own and were kept in a cycle of debt and poverty that was almost impossible to escape. His father was a preacher, and the household was large and poor and deeply Southern. Like millions of black families during these decades, the Barksdales eventually decided to leave the South behind and head north, searching for jobs, safety, and a fair shot. This huge movement of people from the rural South to northern cities is known as the Great Migration, and the Barksdale family was part of it when they moved to Chicago in 1957, when David was around 10 years old. But the better life they were chasing did not simply appear when they arrived. Chicago in the late 1950s was a city sharply divided by race, and black families were funneled into specific, overcrowded neighborhoods through unfair housing practices and aggressive city policies. Some residents bitterly described what was happening to them as removal dressed up in polite language. The neighborhoods they were pushed into were under constant pressure, with tension between racial groups and very little protection or opportunity for the young people growing up there. For a poor black teenager in that environment, the world could be a hostile place, and safety was not something the authorities provided. You found it yourself, often by sticking together with others who faced the same dangers. That is exactly how Barksdale's story in Chicago began. As a young teenager in the Englewood neighborhood on the South Side, he and other boys formed a group for protection. In a place where rival groups and racial conflict made simply walking down the street risky, banding together was a matter of survival. The early group he was part of had a name that would evolve over time, and Barksdale, even as a kid, showed something the others did not have. He was a natural leader. People followed him. He had presence, a kind of authority that made others want to line up behind him, and he was a survivor in a place that did not let many people survive for long. By his early teens, he was already leading. He took charge of a faction and began doing what would define his entire short life. He started bringing smaller groups together under one banner. Instead of letting all these little neighborhood crews fight each other endlessly, he had the vision to unite them into something bigger and more organized, where each group could keep its own identity but operate under a shared leadership. By the mid-1960s, this growing network had become known as the Black Disciples, and Barksdale sat at the top of it. The young man who had arrived from Mississippi with nothing was now the head of one of the rising powers on the South Side, and he had earned the title that stuck to him forever. They called him King David. Now here is where his story gets genuinely complicated, and where a careful video essay has to slow down and be honest, because the truth about David Barksdale is more interesting than the simple version. If you look at his actual arrest record, he does not look like a crime lord at all. Across his life as an adult, he was arrested around 25 times, but he was charged far less often than that, and he was never convicted of a serious crime. He frequently used a fake name when he was picked up, and a lot of what shows up on his record is minor, small-time stuff. He did not die rich. He did not build the kind of personal fortune that later figures in this story would. On paper, he was almost a small-time hustler, who happened to lead a very large group. That gap between his fearsome reputation and his thin criminal record is one of the most fascinating things about him. So what made him so feared, and so loved at the same time? Part of it was simply his power as a leader. People who knew him said his presence alone could send a chill through a room, that just looking at him could make a person nervous. He led his group through violent struggles against rivals, the most important of which was an intense and bloody competition with another rising South Side power, the Blackstone Rangers, led by a young man named Jeff Fort. The fighting between these groups turned whole neighborhoods into battlegrounds, with cycles of retaliation that seemed to have no end. In that world, the leader who could command respect and instill fear held real authority, and Barksdale had both. But there was another side to him, and it is the side that turned him into a legend rather than just a name. As Barksdale grew older, he became deeply troubled by the constant funerals, by watching young men from his own community lose their lives in pointless feuds. He started to see that the violence he had once used to build his reputation was tearing apart the very neighborhoods he claimed to represent. And so he began to channel his group's power and resources in a different direction. The Black Disciples started providing real services to the community. They set up health clinics. They ran free meal programs for hungry children. Barksdale used some of the money and influence he had to help the people around him, and there are stories of him going to schoolyards in the South Shore neighborhood in the early 1970s and tossing stacks of $1 bills to the children playing there. He went even further, stepping into the larger movement for black rights and dignity that was sweeping the country at the time. He made connections with the wider civil rights world. He is remembered for marching in support of fair treatment and against racial discrimination, including in a famous and dangerous march in a Chicago park where peaceful demonstrators faced violent opposition from white crowds. Most strikingly, he built a relationship with Fred Hampton, the young and brilliant leader of the Chicago branch of the Black Panther Party, a group focused on black empowerment, community programs, and resistance to police mistreatment. Barksdale and Hampton worked together to organize against police brutality and racial injustice. This is why so many people in his community did not see him as a criminal at all. They saw him as a protector, a provider, and a leader who used whatever power he had to lift up the people who had been pushed down. To them, he truly was a king. This is the central tension of David Barksdale, and a good essay does not try to flatten it into something simple. He was a gang leader and a community figure at the same time. He commanded a group capable of real violence, and he also fed hungry children and stood up for civil rights. Both things were true. He was, in the fullest sense, a complicated man, someone who held the capacity for harm and the desire to help inside the same person. Trying to call him purely good or purely bad misses what actually made him so important and so remembered. The single most consequential decision of his life came out of his exhaustion with the bloodshed. Barksdale grew tired of the endless warfare, and he looked at his situation strategically. There was another powerful young leader on the South Side named Larry Hoover, who ran a group called the Supreme Gangsters. Instead of fighting Hoover forever, Barksdale proposed something radical, a merger. He suggested that the two organizations join forces, combining their members, their territory, and their resources into one much larger organization. Hoover agreed. And so, at the end of the 1960s, the two groups came together to form the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. This was a turning point in the history of Chicago, and frankly in the history of American street organizations. By joining forces, Barksdale and Hoover did not just reduce some of the fighting between their two groups. They created something unprecedented in the city, an organization with more members, more reach, and more resources than any single street group had ever assembled there before. Barksdale took the title of King, the figurehead and the soul of the organization, while Hoover took the title of Chairman, the man focused on structure and operations. It was a partnership of two very different leaders, and together they held a tight, tense grip over a huge stretch of the South Side. The seeds of an empire had been planted, but David Barksdale would not live to see what that empire became. The violence he had spent his later years trying to escape reached out and took him after all, just slowly. In June of 1970, Barksdale was standing outside a bar on the South Side, in the company of Larry Hoover, when members of the rival Blackstone Rangers opened fire on him using military-style rifles. He was hit several times. Against the odds, he survived the attack itself. But surviving is not the same as being whole. The wounds, and a bullet that did lasting damage inside his body, began a slow destruction of his health that no amount of recovery could reverse. The injuries badly damaged his kidneys, the organs that keep the body clean and functioning, and over the next few years his health steadily declined. His body simply could not recover from what had been done to it. For an extended period he was hospitalized, and eventually confined as his organs began to fail. On September 2, 1974, David Barksdale died of kidney failure that traced directly back to the bullets fired at him 4 years earlier. He was only 27 years old. The young man who had united the South Side, who had fed children and marched for justice, and built one of the largest organizations the city had ever seen, was gone before he ever reached 30. The response was immediate and enormous. Thousands of people attended his funeral, a measure of just how deeply he had touched the lives around him, for better and for worse. He was buried in a cemetery outside the city, and his grave marker carried the name the streets had given him. Every year, his memory is still honored by the organization he helped build. Decades later, his name still echoes through Chicago's culture, spoken with a respect that can be hard for outsiders to understand. It even lives on in the music of a new generation of artists from the city, who reference him as a founding figure, almost a folk hero of the South Side. But his death created a dangerous void, and that is the part of the story that turns dark. The Black Gangster Disciple Nation had been held together largely by Barksdale's personal authority and by his relationship with Larry Hoover. King David was the glue. When that glue was gone, the enormous organization he had helped create began to strain and crack. Without his steadying presence, the alliance he had built would eventually fracture along bitter lines, splitting into rival branches that would turn on each other in the years to come. The dream of a united South Side organization would not survive its founder for long. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the man left holding the reins after Barksdale's death had a sharper, colder, more business-like mind, and he would push the organization toward money and product in a way Barksdale never fully embraced. Under this new leader, it would grow so large and so profitable that the federal government would one day compare him to Al Capone himself. That leader was Larry Hoover, and even a prison cell would not be enough to stop him. Section 5. Larry Hoover, the chairman who ruled from a cell. When David Barksdale died in 1974, the organization he had built did not die with him. It passed into the hands of a partner who thought differently about almost everything. Where Barksdale had been the soul of the operation, the figurehead people loved, Larry Hoover was the structure, the planner, the businessman. And over the next 2 decades, Hoover would take a South Side street organization and turn it into something so large, so organized, and so profitable that federal prosecutors would one day compare him directly to Al Capone. The most astonishing part of his story is not just how big his operation became. It is that he built the largest version of it while locked inside a prison cell, where most people assume a leader loses all his power. Larry Hoover was born in 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi, and like the Barksdale family, his parents joined the Great Migration North, moving to Chicago when Larry was about 4 years old. He grew up on the South Side, in the same hard environment of poverty and limited opportunity that shaped so many young men in this story. By the time he was a teenager, around 13 years old, he had dropped out of school and joined the street life, running with a group called the Supreme Gangsters, doing the kind of low-level crimes that came with that world. He was not a follower for long. As the Supreme Gangsters grew, Hoover rose to lead them, showing early the organizational mind that would later define him. His path crossed with David Barksdale's because their two groups were rivals at first, fighting over the same South Side turf. But as covered earlier, the two young leaders eventually made the historic decision to merge their organizations, combining the Supreme Gangsters and the Black Disciples into the Black Gangster Disciple Nation at the end of the 1960s. Barksdale took the title of King. Hoover took the title of Chairman. And while Barksdale lived, the two shared power. But Barksdale's health was already failing from the attack that would eventually take his life, and when he died in 1974, Hoover stepped into the role of the single most powerful figure in the organization. The chairman was now in charge. Here is the twist that makes Hoover's story so different from everyone else's. By the time he fully took control of the organization, he was already in prison, and he would never walk free again. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to 1973. That year, a 19-year-old named William Young, who went by the nickname Pookie, was suspected by the organization of stealing money and product from them. Hoover ordered that Young be dealt with, and another member of the group carried out the killing, taking Young to an alley and ending his life there. Both Hoover and the man who pulled the trigger were arrested in 1973 and convicted. Hoover received a sentence of 150 to 200 years in state prison. By any normal logic, that should have been the end of his story. A man sentenced to nearly 2 centuries behind bars should have faded from power completely. Instead, Hoover did something almost no one expected. He kept running the organization from inside prison, and not only kept it running, he made it bigger and stronger than it had ever been on the outside. This is the central, almost unbelievable fact of his career. He turned a prison cell into a headquarters. He gave orders that traveled out to the streets through a network of visitors, messages, and loyal lieutenants. He recruited new members from among the other people incarcerated alongside him, spreading the organization's reach throughout the state prison system at the same time as it spread across the streets of Chicago. The walls that were supposed to cut him off from the world became, instead, just a different kind of office. Under Hoover's direction from behind bars, the organization took control of a large share of the drug trade on Chicago's South Side and then far beyond it. What had started as a local street operation grew into a sprawling enterprise. Prosecutors would later say the organization expanded to tens of thousands of members across dozens of states, with its reach stretching into city after city around the country. At its peak in the early 1990s, the government estimated that the organization was bringing in around $100 million a year through drug sales under Hoover's leadership. Let that number sink in. $100 million a year, directed by a man who was, the entire time, sitting in a state prison serving a sentence for murder. Hoover did not just run a criminal operation. He built a structure, an actual organized system with rules, ranks, and a chain of command. He thought like the chairman of a corporation, which is exactly why that title fit him. He created order out of what had been chaotic street activity, imposing discipline and hierarchy. He even put his ideas down in writing. He developed a whole philosophy and set of teachings for the organization, eventually published in a document that reframed the group around concepts he called growth and development. The Gangster Disciples, as the organization came to be known under him, were not just a loose collection of young men anymore. They were a machine, with Hoover's mind at the controls. And then Hoover made his most ambitious and most clever move, the one that nearly got him out. He began rebranding himself and the organization as something positive. He launched a political action committee, an organized group designed to get involved in politics and voting. This committee was cited for organizing thousands of people to take part in protests at City Hall during the 1990s, presenting the organization as a force for community empowerment and political change. Hoover positioned the group not as a criminal enterprise but as a movement focused on bettering the lives of Black Chicagoans. He set up nonprofit organizations, the kind of charities that are supposed to help people in need. To the public, and to some genuine supporters, it looked like a remarkable transformation, a former crime leader turning his organization toward community service and political action. It was, according to federal prosecutors, almost entirely a front. Investigators came to believe that the so-called charities and community organizations were actually being used as covers, ways to make the operation look legitimate, and to move and clean the money flowing in from drug sales. When the case eventually went to trial, members of the organization testified that the money raised by these supposed charities never actually went to helping anyone in need. The community image, the prosecutors argued, was a mask over the same enterprise Hoover had been running all along. Whether every part of this is the full truth or whether some of Hoover's reform efforts were sincere is something people still debate. But the government's position was clear. The transformation was a performance, and the real business never stopped. What finally brought Hoover down was patience and technology. Federal authorities did not believe his reformed image, and they decided to prove that he was still running a criminal operation from behind bars. The challenge was that Hoover was careful. He knew his phone calls might be monitored, so he avoided talking openly about business on the prison phones. So in the early 1990s, investigators got permission for a clever trick. When gang leaders came to visit Hoover in person, they were given visitor identification badges. The authorities hid tiny transmitters, listening devices, inside those badges. As a result, when Hoover sat down with his lieutenants believing he was speaking privately, the government was recording everything. Over the course of a long investigation that stretched across many years, agents gathered the evidence they needed by listening to the chairman direct his organization in what he thought was secret. In 1995, after this lengthy undercover effort, Hoover was indicted on federal charges. He was pulled out of the state prison where he had been held and moved to a federal facility in downtown Chicago to face trial. The charges were sweeping. He was accused of running a continuing criminal enterprise, along with drug conspiracy, extortion, and money laundering, a total of dozens of separate counts. The trial laid out the full picture of the operation he had directed from his cell, including the recordings of him speaking with his lieutenants. In 1997, a jury found Larry Hoover guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in federal prison, stacked on top of the 150 to 200-year state sentence he was already serving. The chairman had finally been stopped, but stopping him took the harshest confinement the federal system had to offer. Hoover was sent to a place known as the Federal Supermax Prison, located in Florence, Colorado. This facility is considered the most secure prison in the entire country. It is where the government holds its most dangerous and high-profile inmates, people it believes simply cannot be allowed any contact with the outside world. According to his attorneys, Hoover spent much of his time there in extreme isolation, confined for the vast majority of each day in a tiny concrete cell. The whole point of sending him there was to do what no prison had managed before, to actually cut him off from his organization, to silence the chairman by sealing him away where his orders could not reach anyone. After decades of running an empire from behind bars, he was finally placed somewhere the bars truly held. Hoover's story did not end quietly, though, and it has taken some remarkable turns in recent years that any current essay has to include. Over time, he became almost a symbol for different causes. To many in Chicago, especially those who came up in the culture he influenced, he remained a legendary figure, and a movement grew calling for his release. In December of 2021, two of the biggest names in music, the artists known as Ye and Drake, held a large benefit concert in Los Angeles called the Free Larry Hoover Concert, aimed at drawing attention to his case and to the broader cause of prison and sentencing reform. The event put his name back in the national spotlight decades after he had been locked away, and it framed him for a new generation as a face of arguments about whether the punishments handed down in earlier decades were too harsh. Then came an even bigger development. In May of 2025, President Donald Trump commuted Hoover's federal life sentences. A commutation means the punishment is reduced or cut short, though it does not erase the conviction itself. This was a massive moment, and it is exactly the kind of fact that separates a well-researched essay from a lazy one, because it would be easy to assume this meant Hoover walked free. He did not. Here is the crucial detail. The presidential commutation applied only to his federal sentences. It did not touch his original state conviction for the 1973 murder, the 150 to 200-year sentence handed down by an Illinois court. Because that state sentence still stands, Hoover remained in custody. He was moved out of the federal supermax system and back into the state prison system to continue serving his state time. His supporters, including his own family, have continued pushing for his release through the separate state process, while prosecutors in Cook County have argued he should stay behind bars. As of the most recent information available, that fight was still ongoing, with his fate ultimately resting in the hands of state authorities. So how do we make sense of Larry Hoover, and why does he matter so much in the story of Chicago crime? Look at what he proved. He proved that a criminal organization could outgrow the streets it came from and become a national enterprise with the structure of a real corporation. He proved, terrifyingly, that imprisoning a leader does not always end his power, that a determined and organized mind can run an empire through walls and visits and hidden channels for decades. And he proved how powerful image can be, how a criminal operation could dress itself up in the language of community service and politics and convince a portion of the public it had changed. Federal prosecutors compared him to Al Capone for a reason. Like Capone, he built something enormous. Unlike Capone, he built most of it after he was already behind bars, which in some ways makes his achievement even more chilling. He is the bridge between two eras of this story. He took the community-rooted vision of King David and transformed it into a cold, sprawling business empire, showing what these Southside organizations could become when run by a pure organizer rather than a folk hero. The age of the local protective crew was over. The age of the massive, structured, money-driven enterprise had arrived, and Hoover was its master. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But while Hoover was building his organization through structure and discipline, his old rival from the Blackstone Rangers, the man whose group had fired the rifles that ultimately killed David Barksdale, was building something even stranger. He took his organization to a place no American street leader had ever gone. He reached across an ocean, made contact with a hostile foreign government, and tried to strike a deal that would land him in the history books for a reason no one could have predicted. His name was Jeff Fort. Section 6. Jeff Fort, the street leader who reached across the ocean. Larry Hoover ran his organization through structure and discipline, and that was remarkable enough. But his great rival took a completely different and far stranger path, one that ended with him making history in a way no American street leader ever had before or has since. Jeff Fort did not just build an organization in Chicago. He took it somewhere no one could have imagined, reaching across the ocean to a hostile foreign government and trying to strike a deal that would put his name into the record books for the most unexpected reason of all. His story starts on the same hard South Side streets as everyone else in this part of the tale, but it ends in a place none of the others ever went. Jeff Fort was born in 1947 in Aberdeen, Mississippi, and his family, like the Barksdales and the Hoovers, joined the great movement of black families heading north. They settled in the Woodlawn neighborhood on Chicago's South Side in the mid-1950s when Fort was a young boy. School did not hold him. He dropped out after the 9th grade, and like so many young men in his situation, he ended up cycling through the juvenile system. It was inside one of those facilities for boys that he met another young man named Eugene Hairston, and together, around the end of the 1950s, the two of them started a group that would become one of the most powerful street organizations in the city's history. It began under the name the Blackstone Rangers, taking its name from the area where Fort lived and where his crew gathered. The Blackstone Rangers grew fast, and Fort grew with them. In the beginning, the group had two leaders, Fort and Hairston, but over time, Fort became the dominant figure, the one who would steer the organization for decades to come. The Rangers absorbed smaller groups, expanded their territory, and became fierce rivals with the other rising power on the south side, the Black Disciples led by David Barksdale. As covered earlier, this rivalry was bloody and relentless, and it was members of Fort's organization who carried out the rifle attack in 1970 that ultimately led to Barksdale's death. The two organizations and their leaders were locked in a struggle that shaped the entire South Side. In the late 1960s, something happened that reveals just how big and visible Fort's organization had become. This was a time when the federal government was pouring money into programs meant to fight poverty and help struggling communities. Fort's organization received funding through one of these anti-poverty programs, money that was supposed to go toward job training and helping young people. But the program came under investigation amid accusations that the funds were being misused and funneled into criminal activity rather than the legitimate purposes intended. Fort was called to testify before a committee of the United States Senate about what had happened to the money. In a moment that became famous, Fort showed up, but instead of answering questions, he essentially walked out. For that defiance, he was convicted of contempt of Congress. A few years later, in the early 1970s, he was convicted of misusing those federal funds and sentenced to prison. This is where Fort's story takes the first of its dramatic turns. He served time at a federal prison, and during that time, something significant happened to him. He converted to Islam, the religion, and embraced a new identity, taking a new name for himself. When he was released in the mid-1970s, he was a changed man in terms of how he presented himself and his organization, even as the underlying operation continued. He took the organization he led and reshaped it around this new religious identity. He renamed the group, transforming the old Blackstone organization into something he called El Rukn, a name drawn from Arabic meaning the pillar. He set up a headquarters in an old vacant movie theater on the south side, a building his people came to call the Fort. There has long been a debate about why Fort wrapped his organization in the language and structure of a religion. Some believed it was a genuine spiritual transformation, but law enforcement had a more cynical view. They suspected that by presenting El Rukn as a religious organization rather than a street group, Fort was trying to take advantage of the special legal protections that religious institutions enjoy. Religious groups are harder for the police to investigate and surveil, because the law puts up extra barriers to protect freedom of worship. The theory among investigators was that Fort was using the appearance of a faith to make it harder for them to watch and prosecute his operation. Whatever the real reason, El Rukn became the new face of one of the most powerful organizations in Chicago, with Fort firmly at its head. Through the 1970s, the organization was deeply involved in the drug trade, dealing in serious quantities of product on the south side. And this involvement eventually caught up with Fort. In 1983, he was convicted on drug trafficking charges and sentenced to a significant prison term, sent to a federal facility in Texas. By all appearances, this should have removed him from power, the same way prison was supposed to remove Hoover. And just like Hoover, Fort refused to let the walls stop him. From inside that Texas prison, Fort continued to direct his organization back in Chicago through near-daily phone calls, giving orders to his lieutenants, who ran things on the ground. The leader was locked away, but the leadership never stopped. And then comes the chapter that makes Jeff Fort unlike anyone else in this entire story, the part that genuinely belongs in a category all its own. While sitting in that Texas prison cell in the mid-1980s, Fort learned something that gave him an extraordinary idea. He became aware that the government of Libya, a North African nation whose leader at the time, Muammar Gaddafi, was deeply hostile to the United States, had given a large sum of money to another prominent figure connected to Chicago. Fort reportedly looked at that and thought, why not us? He developed a plan to offer the services of his organization to the Libyan government. The idea was breathtaking in its boldness and its danger. In exchange for a large payment, reported to be around $2.5 million, Fort's organization would carry out acts of violence and destruction inside the United States, on American soil, on behalf of a foreign government that wished America harm. Let that idea settle for a moment, because it is almost hard to believe. This was not a drug deal or a turf war. This was the leader of a Chicago street organization directing operations from a prison cell, attempting to become a paid agent of a hostile foreign power, willing to attack his own country for money. To make the plan happen, Fort directed members of his organization to actually travel overseas. Some of his people went to Libya to meet with officials of that government. When tensions between the United States and Libya made further travel there too risky, the meetings shifted to a Libyan diplomatic location in Panama, where Fort's representatives continued the negotiations. Fort wanted to prove to the Libyans that his organization was capable and committed. He had his people work on demonstrating their seriousness, including efforts to make the group look large and dangerous and capable of carrying out what they were promising. The organization even acquired what they believed was a real military weapon, an item designed to destroy armored vehicles, as part of showing they could deliver on the violence they were offering. They were, by every appearance, deadly serious about going through with the scheme. But here is what Fort did not know. The whole time he was orchestrating this plot, the federal government was listening. Investigators had been monitoring the organization's communications as part of a drug investigation, and through those court-approved wiretaps, they began catching pieces of conversations that pointed at something far bigger than narcotics. They realized the organization was communicating with representatives of a hostile foreign government and plotting attacks. A special task force focused on terrorism took over and dug deeper, uncovering the full scope of the conspiracy. To gather the final evidence and to make sure the plot could never actually be carried out, the government sent in an undercover operative, and it was through this operation that Fort's people obtained that supposed military weapon, which allowed agents to move in. A search turned up weapons, and the case was sealed. In 1987, the government brought a sweeping indictment against Fort and several members of his organization. A 50-count case centered on the conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism inside the United States for a foreign government. The trial took place that fall and lasted about 2 months. In November of 1987, the jury found Fort and his co-defendants guilty. The significance of this conviction is enormous, and it is the single fact that makes Fort's case historic. This was the first time that American citizens were convicted of conspiring to commit acts of terrorism in their own country, for money, on behalf of a foreign government. There had simply never been a case like it before. A Chicago street leader had earned a place in American legal history not for drugs or violence in the ordinary sense, but for attempting to become a weapon of a foreign enemy. For this terrorism conspiracy, Fort was sentenced to 80 years in federal prison. His legal troubles did not end there. The following year, in 1988, Fort faced another trial, this one for ordering the killing of a rival back in 1981. He was convicted in that case as well, and handed an additional lengthy sentence to be served on top of the terrorism sentence. Stack everything together, the original drug trafficking conviction, the 80-year terrorism sentence, and the additional decades for the murder conviction, and the total amount of time Fort was sentenced to became so vast that the exact figure is reported differently in different places. The bottom line is simpler and more certain than any single number. Jeff Fort was never going to be a free man again. Between the federal terrorism case and the state murder case, his fate was sealed for the rest of his life. Like Hoover, Fort was eventually sent to the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, the most secure facility in the country, where the government holds the inmates it considers most dangerous, and the government took extraordinary measures to keep Fort cut off from the world. After everything he had managed to orchestrate from previous prison cells, the authorities were determined that he would never again be able to direct anything from behind bars. He was kept in deep isolation, with his contact with the outside world restricted almost completely, allowed communication only with his lawyers and immediate family under tight controls. The man who had once run an organization across an ocean from a Texas cell was finally placed somewhere designed specifically to ensure he could reach no one. In recent years, Fort, now an elderly man, has sought relief through the legal system, including a request to be released early based on his age and the length of time he has served. A federal judge rejected that request, ruling that Fort deserved the long sentence he had received for plotting to carry out attacks inside the United States. The judge underscored the seriousness of what Fort had done, the fact that he had coordinated a plot to harm his own country in exchange for foreign money, all directed from inside a prison cell. As of the most recent information, Fort remains incarcerated, living out his final years in the same kind of extreme isolation the government determined was necessary to neutralize him. So what do we take away from the story of Jeff Fort, and why does he stand apart even in a story full of powerful and dangerous men? Every other figure in this tale operated within recognizable boundaries. They fought over territory, ran drugs, built organizations, accumulated money and power. Their ambitions, however large, stayed inside the world of crime. Fort blew past all of that. He took a street organization and pointed it at the entire nation, attempting to turn it into a tool of a foreign enemy. He demonstrated something genuinely frightening, that the structures these leaders built could, in the wrong hands, be aimed at targets far beyond a rival corner or a competing crew. His case forced the country to confront a possibility it had never seriously considered, that a homegrown street organization could become a vehicle for foreign aggression. That is why his conviction was a first, and that is why his name occupies a unique and chilling place in the history of American crime. He also shares with Hoover the same eerie lesson, that for the most determined of these leaders, prison was not an ending. Both men ran their organizations from inside cells for years, and it took the absolute extreme of American confinement, total isolation in a supermax facility, to finally silence them. The ordinary tools of justice, arrest, and imprisonment were simply not enough for figures of their ambition and reach. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Up to this point, every major figure in this story has been the head of a large, structured organization, a boss commanding an army of members. But the next chapter introduces a very different kind of figure, a man who did not need a vast organization or a famous name to leave a mark on the city. He operated more on his own terms, built a personal fortune in the drug trade, and became legendary not for the size of his crew but for the unbelievable, almost theatrical way he chose to display his wealth, even in death. They called him Fluky. Section 7. Fluky Stokes, the showman of the South Side. Every figure in this story so far has been the head of something large. Capone, Accardo, and Giancana ran the outfit. Barksdale, Hoover, and Fort each led massive organizations with thousands of members. But the next man was different. He did not need an army or a famous organization behind him. He built his fortune more on his own terms, as an independent operator in the drug trade, and he became one of the most legendary figures in Chicago, not because of the size of his crew, but because of the unforgettable, almost theatrical way he chose to flaunt his wealth, especially in death. His name was William Stokes, but the city knew him as Fluky, and the story of how he and his son were laid to rest became so strange and so famous that it inspired a song and spread far beyond Chicago. William Morris Stokes was born in 1937 and came up on the south side of Chicago. He was not part of the great structured organizations that dominate the rest of this story. He carved out his own place in the underworld, building a personal operation in the drug trade. He dealt in serious product, the kind that flowed through the neighborhoods of the South Side, and he ran legitimate fronts alongside it, including pool halls. Over time, he built a reputation as a major supplier, someone whose operation moved real quantities and generated real money. When the law eventually spoke about him, a senior official with the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency described him as having been one of the biggest sources of supply for hard drugs in the entire city. That is the scale we are talking about. Fluky Stokes was not a corner dealer. He was a kingpin in his own right, operating largely independently rather than as the head of some named nation or family. But what made Stokes legendary was not just the size of his operation. It was the way he lived, the way he presented himself to the world. Fluky Stokes was a showman, a man who wanted everyone to see exactly how successful he had become. He dressed in fine silk suits. His fingers were loaded with diamond rings, so large that observers compared them to the size of silver dollars. He wore gold bracelets stacked on his forearms, a jeweled watch, and a gold chain with a diamond-studded letter F hanging from it. F for Fluky. He drove luxury cars and lived a life of open, dazzling excess. In a neighborhood where most people had very little, Stokes made sure his wealth was impossible to miss. He turned himself into a kind of local legend through sheer flamboyance. And here is a part of his story that complicates the simple picture of a drug dealer, because the people around him did not see him as a villain. In his community, Fluky Stokes was, by many accounts, genuinely beloved. He had a reputation for acts of kindness toward the people in his neighborhood. He was known to help the elderly, to bring food to people who needed it, to give money with no strings attached to families who came to him in hard times. There are stories of him helping a family whose home had burned down. This is one of those uncomfortable truths that a careful telling has to include. The money that fueled all of this generosity came from the drug trade, from a product that did real harm in the very communities he was helping. Stokes was, at the same time, a source of damage and a source of help to the people around him. To understand why he was so mourned, you have to hold both of those facts together. The neighborhood did not experience him as a distant criminal. They experienced him as a man who showed up for them, even as the source of his wealth quietly hurt them. By the mid-1980s, Stokes was at the height of his wealth and notoriety. His operation was said to be enormous, with reports describing him as controlling a large number of drug houses and employing a significant number of people in his organization, bringing in vast sums of money. He celebrated his success openly. In 1985, he threw a party for his 30th wedding anniversary that reportedly cost around $200,000, an almost unimaginable sum for such an event at the time. Everything about Fluky Stokes was big, loud, and impossible to ignore. But the event that truly carved his name into history was not a celebration. It was a funeral, and it was not even his own. In February of 1984, tragedy struck the Stokes family. Fluky's son, also named William, and known by the nickname Willie the Wimp, was killed. The younger Stokes had followed in his father's footsteps, involved in the same world of drugs and gambling, and he died young, in his late 20s. For most families, a loss like this would mean a quiet, private grief. But Fluky Stokes was not most fathers, and the send-off he arranged for his son became one of the most astonishing spectacles the city had ever seen, a display of wealth and grief so extreme that people are still talking about it decades later. Stokes had his son buried in a custom-built casket designed to look like a Cadillac, specifically modeled after a Cadillac Seville, which was a luxury car of the era. This was not a coffin with a car painted on it. It was an elaborate creation. Before the funeral, the casket was taken to people who worked on cars, and they added a genuine front grille from a Cadillac and a rear section, fitting it out to truly resemble the vehicle. They installed working headlights and taillights that actually lit up. They added a windshield, a steering wheel, a dashboard, and wheels, transforming the coffin into something that looked like a real automobile. It even had a vanity license plate bearing the nickname Wimp. The younger Stokes was placed inside, not lying down in the traditional way, but positioned seated, as if he were behind the wheel of the car, his hands set near the steering wheel. And the details went further still. Willie the Wimp was dressed in a flashy suit, with a hat and diamond rings, dressed to the standard of wealth his family was known for. Most strikingly of all, money was placed between the fingers of his hands, cash tucked into his grip, a final, jarring symbol of the world he had lived in. Reports on the exact denomination of the bills varied, but the image was unforgettable. A young man laid to rest, seated in a Cadillac-shaped coffin with lit-up headlights, dressed in finery, with cash between his fingers. It was grief turned into pure theater, a father's love expressed through the only language Fluky Stokes seemed to know, the language of overwhelming, undeniable wealth. The funeral drew enormous attention and became a sensation. It was so striking that it crossed over into popular culture in a way almost no underworld event ever does. A musician named Bill Carter wrote a song about it, and that song was later recorded by the famous blues guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan, with the title referencing Willie the Wimp and his Cadillac coffin. The song describes the scene of the funeral, the car-shaped casket, the money, the headlights, turning the spectacle into a piece of music that spread the story far beyond Chicago. Through that song, a South Side drug dealer's extravagant farewell to his son became something known around the world, sung in concerts across continents. It is one of the strangest ways anyone in this entire story achieved a kind of immortality. But the world Fluky Stokes lived in was a dangerous one, no matter how beloved he was or how much wealth he displayed. The same trade that made him rich made him a target, and it eventually came for him too. In November of 1986, about 2 years after he buried his son, Fluky Stokes was killed. He was sitting in a leased Cadillac on a South Side street, near the home of a woman he was seeing, accompanied by his driver. 2 attackers were waiting for him. Both Stokes and his driver lost their lives in the attack. There is a poignant, almost ironic detail in how he died. The man who had spent his life draped in silk and diamonds, who had turned flamboyance into his signature, was not dressed in any of his finery that day. He was wearing ordinary, casual clothing, jogging clothes, with no jewelry at all. The showman met his end stripped of the costume that had made him famous. Fluky Stokes was around 48 years old when he died, and in death, just as he had done for his son, his family gave him a send-off befitting his legend, though somewhat more restrained than the spectacle of the Cadillac coffin. He was laid out in a fine mahogany casket with a custom-designed interior. He was dressed once again in the colors and style he had loved in life, in a blue suit with matching accessories, even blue python skin shoes, with a portable telephone placed with him, a nod to the trappings of his lifestyle. The response from the community was overwhelming. Thousands upon thousands of people came to pass by his casket and pay their respects, an extraordinary turnout that showed just how large a figure he had been in the life of the South Side. People spoke of him with affection and even reverence. There were accounts of parents lifting their young children up over the casket so they could get a look at him, treating the moment almost as a brush with greatness. He was buried in a crypt he had purchased, paying for it in cash, in the same way he had done everything. The image of mothers holding their children up to see the body of a drug kingpin captures the deep contradiction at the heart of Fluky Stokes. To the authorities, he was a major dealer responsible for moving large amounts of a harmful product into the community. To much of that same community, he was a hero, a generous benefactor, a local legend whose passing was a genuine loss. Both of these things were true at once, and that is exactly what makes his story so important to understand correctly. It is easy to tell a story of crime in simple terms, with clear villains. Fluky Stokes does not allow that. He forces you to sit with the uncomfortable reality that the same person could be both a source of harm and a source of help, mourned by the very neighborhood his trade quietly damaged. His story also stands apart from the others in this tale for a different reason. He was not the head of a great organization with a structure and a hierarchy and a recognizable name. He did not build an enterprise designed to outlast him or expand across states. He was an individual operator who built a personal fortune and lived as large as humanly possible while he could. His legacy is not an organization that carried on after his death. His legacy is an image, a story, a song. He proved that you did not need to lead a nation of thousands to become legendary. Sometimes all it took was a life lived loud enough, and a Cadillac-shaped coffin with the headlights still shining. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In a way, Fluky Stokes represents a certain era of the Chicago drug trade, a time when an independent operator could rise to the top of the supply chain on his own terms and live like a king on the South Side. But the trade was changing. The product flowing into Chicago did not appear out of nowhere. It came from somewhere, moving through a vast chain that stretched far beyond the city, far beyond the state, all the way to powerful organizations in another country entirely. As the years went on, the connection between Chicago's streets and those distant suppliers would grow tighter and more direct, until two young men from the city, twin brothers, would rise to become the most significant drug traffickers in Chicago's entire history, with a direct line to the most wanted man in the world. Section 8. The Flores Twins. The highway of product into the city. The product that flowed through Fluky Stokes and every other dealer in this story did not come from nowhere. It moved along a vast chain that stretched far beyond Chicago, far beyond Illinois, all the way to powerful organizations in another country. For most of the 20th century, the men at the top of Chicago's drug trade were still a few steps removed from the original source. But that changed in dramatic fashion in the early 2000s, when two young men from the city, twin brothers who started out at the very bottom, climbed all the way to the top of the global supply chain and built a direct line to the most wanted man in the world. Their names were Pedro and Margarito Flores, and federal prosecutors would eventually call them the most significant drug traffickers in Chicago's entire history. Their beginnings could not have been more ordinary. The Flores twins grew up in Little Village, a heavily Mexican-American neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago. They were born in the mid-1970s, and crime ran in the family. Their father had been involved in smuggling product from Mexico into the United States, and an older brother had also been involved in drug dealing and went to prison in the late 1990s. So the twins grew up around the trade, learning its rhythms from the people closest to them. But what makes their rise so remarkable is just how far they climbed from such modest starting points. One of the brothers has described working a job flipping burgers at a fast food restaurant in Little Village as a young man. They started as ordinary kids in an ordinary neighborhood, and they would end up negotiating directly with one of the most feared criminals on the planet. The twins began as street-level dealers in Chicago, but they had a gift for the business, and they thought about it differently than most. They treated drug trafficking like a real business, focused on efficiency, scale, and relationships. One striking detail is that the brothers have said they modeled their operation partly on the way a fast food empire works, focusing on consistency, volume, and reliable systems, the same principles that let a burger chain serve millions of customers. Instead of staying as middlemen who bought from one supplier and sold to another, they understood a key insight about the trade. The higher up the chain you go, the cheaper the product gets, and the more money you keep. So they set out to climb that chain, cutting out the people in the middle and building relationships directly with the most powerful suppliers they could reach. Those suppliers were in Mexico, and they were the leaders of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world. The twins worked their way up until they were dealing directly with the top of the Sinaloa organization, one of the largest and most notorious drug enterprises on Earth, and a rival organization as well. The man at the head of the Sinaloa operation was Joaquin Guzman, known around the world by his nickname El Chapo, which means Shorty. He was, at the time, perhaps the most wanted and most powerful drug lord alive, a man whose organization moved enormous quantities of product across the globe and who operated with seeming impunity, even escaping from prison. For two young men from Little Village to rise to the point of doing business face-to-face with a figure like that is almost hard to comprehend. Gaining the trust of people at that level was not easy, and it was incredibly dangerous. Early in their dealings in the mid-2000s, one of the twins, Pedro, was kidnapped by an associate connected to that world and held for an extended period under terrible conditions. To win his brother's freedom, Margarito had to travel into the mountains of northern Mexico and negotiate directly, ultimately settling a debt to secure Pedro's release. This was the brutal reality of the world they had entered. These were not ordinary business partners. The slightest misstep, the slightest perceived disrespect or unpaid debt could cost you your life or the life of someone you loved. And yet the twins kept climbing, kept building those relationships until they had become trusted, high-volume customers of the cartel's leadership. The scale of what they built is staggering, and the numbers are genuinely hard to wrap your mind around. Over the course of their operation, primarily in the mid-2000s, the The Flores brothers were responsible for importing and distributing enormous quantities of product. Federal authorities have stated that, at a minimum, they moved over 70 tons of product, mostly a hard drug but also another, through the United States. To picture that, 70 tons is the weight of dozens of large vehicles. This was not a neighborhood operation. It was a national distribution network. The product came up from South America, through Mexico, and into the United States, using every method imaginable, including planes, boats, and even submarines to move it through the early stages, before it traveled to Chicago through a system of hidden storage houses, warehouses, and vehicles fitted with secret compartments. Their high-volume customers across the country received on average enormous monthly shipments, and the money flowing back the other way was just as staggering. The brothers and their network were responsible for laundering, meaning cleaning and hiding, more than $1 billion. A judge who later handled their case would describe their operation in vivid terms, saying that if the city of Chicago had walls, their operation had devastated those walls, and that what they ran had become, in effect, a highway of product running straight into the city. Chicago's geographic position in the middle of the country, with its network of highways and rail lines, made it a natural hub for distribution, and the Flores twins turned that advantage into one of the largest drug operations the city had ever seen. They had become, in plain terms, the kingpins at the very top of Chicago's supply, with a direct pipeline to the global source. But at the absolute height of their power, the twins made a decision that would change everything, not just for them, but for the entire structure of the global drug trade. By 2008, the world they operated in was descending into chaos. The powerful organizations in Mexico that supplied them had broken into a bloody civil war, with former allies turning into bitter enemies and violence exploding across the region. The twins found themselves caught in the middle, with the warring bosses each demanding that the brothers choose a side. Staying neutral was becoming impossible, and the danger to them and their family was growing by the day. Facing this impossible and deadly situation, the Flores brothers made a choice that almost no one in their position ever makes. They decided to cooperate with the United States government. This was an extraordinary and incredibly risky decision. In the world of major drug trafficking, cooperating with the authorities is considered the ultimate betrayal, and it is punished with a special kind of ruthlessness. The brothers knew that by turning, they were marking themselves and their loved ones for potential retaliation for the rest of their lives. And yet, beginning in 2008, that is exactly what they did. And they did not just provide information after the fact. They did something far more dangerous and far more valuable. While still active in the trade, at the very height of their operation, they began secretly recording their conversations with their cartel partners. They wore recording devices and captured their dealings on tape, gathering evidence in real time as the crimes were actually happening. The most jaw-dropping part of this is who they recorded. The twins secretly captured conversations with the top leadership of the cartel, and on at least 2 occasions, they recorded conversations directly with El Chapo himself. Think about the nerve that required. They sat down or got on the phone with one of the most dangerous men in the world, a man who would order the death of anyone who crossed him without a second thought, all while wearing a hidden device that was capturing his every word for the United States government. One of these recordings, played later in court, even caught the drug lord greeting one of the brothers warmly, like a friend, before getting down to the business of a drug deal. That recording, and others like it, would become some of the most powerful evidence ever gathered against the cartel's leadership. The cooperation paid off in massive ways for law enforcement, and it came at a terrible cost to the brothers. Their information led to a wave of seizures, with authorities grabbing hundreds of kilograms of product and many millions of dollars in cash in the Chicago area in a short span, plus a huge load of product elsewhere that was bound for the city. Their cooperation led to charges not just against El Chapo, but against the broader leadership of the cartel and a rival organization, as well as the dismantling of the brothers' own Chicago network and the conviction of many of their high-level customers. But the price was immediate and devastating. In 2009, against the strong advice of his sons and the United States government, the twins' father returned to Mexico. Within days, he was taken, and he was never seen again, presumed to have lost his life as retaliation for what his sons had done. The family had been warned this would happen, and it did. When it came time for the brothers themselves to be sentenced, the situation was unusual. They had committed crimes so enormous that they were facing the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in prison. But the value of their cooperation had been extraordinary, perhaps unmatched in the history of such cases. In 2015, the brothers appeared in federal court in Chicago for sentencing, their first public court appearance in years, after having been kept in protective custody since 2008. The judge made his thinking clear. He said that were it not for their cooperation, he would have sentenced them to life in prison. But because of the unparalleled assistance they had provided, assistance that helped bring down the leadership of the most powerful drug organizations in the world, he gave them a far lighter sentence, 14 years each. The judge added something haunting, though. He pointed out that even with the reduced prison term, the brothers were not really getting off easy, because the danger they now faced would follow them forever. He noted that because of what they had done, they and their families would, in effect, be serving a life sentence of a different kind, always having to look over their shoulders, always at risk of retaliation from the people they had betrayed. They would leave prison eventually, but they would never truly be free. The fate of their father had already shown that the threat was very real. The story reached its climax in 2018 and 2019. By then, El Chapo had been captured and brought to the United States to stand trial in New York. The case against him was one of the most significant drug prosecutions in American history, and the Flores twins were at the heart of it. Pedro Flores took the witness stand and testified directly against the drug lord, telling a jury about their dealings and helping to seal the case. The recordings the brothers had made years earlier, including the conversations with the drug lord himself, were part of the evidence. In early 2019, El Chapo was convicted, and he was sentenced to life in prison, sent to the same kind of extreme supermax facility that holds other figures from this story. The two young men who had started out flipping burgers in Little Village had played a central role in bringing down the most powerful drug lord on the planet. The aftermath of their case has continued to unfold in ways that show just how tangled their world was. The brothers served their prison terms and were released, living quietly in protective arrangements because of the ongoing danger to their lives. But the consequences rippled out to others around them. Their wives both went to prison for their roles in hiding and spending the enormous amounts of money the operation had generated, and the women later wrote a book about their experiences. An older brother also faced charges related to laundering the family's drug money, admitting that he had hidden hundreds of thousands of dollars, including cash buried under the porch of his home. The fortune the twins had built did not simply disappear when they cooperated. It had to be hidden, hunted, and accounted for, and that process pulled their whole family into the legal reckoning. So what is the lasting significance of the Flores twins, and why do they matter so much in this story? They represent the moment when Chicago's drug trade became directly, intimately connected to the global cartel system at the highest possible level. Earlier figures in this tale, even the biggest ones, were still operating mostly within the city or the region, a few steps removed from the original source of the product. The Flores brothers collapsed that distance entirely. Two kids from a Chicago neighborhood rose to do business face to face with the king of the global drug trade. And then, in an almost unbelievable twist, they used that access to help destroy the very empire they had helped to feed. Their story is the story of how Chicago connected to the world, and how that connection, once it was turned against the cartel, helped change the course of the international drug war. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Chicago's underworld was never only about the trade. Running alongside the drug pipelines were the street organizations themselves, vast networks built on territory and fear, with structures as formal as any business and leaders who controlled the activities of thousands across the state. To understand how that kind of power was built and finally broken, we turn to the case of the Latin Kings. Section 9. The Latin Kings, the Crown, and the Constitution. The figures in this story have mostly been suppliers and traffickers, men focused on the product and the money it brought in. But Chicago's underworld was never only about the trade. Running alongside the drug pipelines were the street organizations themselves, enormous networks built on territory, loyalty, and fear, groups that demanded payment from anyone operating on their turf and enforced their rule through violence. The largest of these had structures as formal as any corporation, with leaders, ranks, and written rules that members were expected to follow. And at the very top of one of the biggest of them sat a man who oversaw the activities of thousands of people across an entire state. His name was Augustin Zambrano, and to understand how his kind of power was built and how it was finally broken, you have to understand the Latin Kings. The Latin Kings began in Chicago, with their origin and base in the Little Village neighborhood on the west side of the city. This was a heavily Mexican-American community, the same general area where the Flores twins had grown up, and the Latin Kings became one of the most powerful organizations to emerge from it. But unlike a single drug operation focused mainly on moving product, the Latin Kings were a true street organization in the fullest sense. They were about controlling territory. They were about commanding respect and obedience. They were about building a structure that could hold thousands of members together under a single set of rules. And from their roots in Chicago, they spread outward, throughout the city, across the state of Illinois, and into other states entirely, where local branches operated with some independence, but still answered to the rules and the hierarchy that traced back to Chicago. What makes the Latin Kings particularly striking, and what a good telling has to emphasize, is just how organized they were. This was not a loose collection of young men hanging on corners. This was a structured institution with its own internal government. The organization had a written set of rules, documents that members described using formal names, including a constitution, a manifesto, and a specific set of rules tied to the Little Village area. These written codes laid out how the organization was supposed to function. There was a multi-page list of rules establishing procedures for serious matters, including how violence was to be carried out, how security was to be maintained, and how certain illegal businesses were to be run. Members attended regular meetings, gatherings where they planned their activities and enforced their rules. New members were initiated through ritual physical beatings administered by existing members. This was an organization that ran itself like a shadow institution, with laws, leadership, and a chain of command as deliberate as anything in the legitimate world. The leadership structure had its own titles, drawn from the imagery of royalty that gives the organization its name. At the top of the entire nationwide organization sat a leader who held the title of Corona, a word meaning crown. This was the King of Kings, the highest authority over all the factions of the organization. Beneath that top position were regional leaders who controlled large areas, holding titles like Inca, each commanding the members within their territory. There were enforcers responsible for carrying out violence and discipline. It was a pyramid of power, with authority flowing down from the Corona at the peak, through the regional leaders, down to the soldiers on the street. And the man who came to hold that highest title, the Corona, the crown over the entire organization, was Augustin Zambrano. Zambrano went by several nicknames, including Tino, and, fittingly given his seniority, names that referred to him as the Old Man. As the Corona, he was responsible for overseeing the illegal activities of all the factions of this powerful organization, and the scale of what he oversaw was enormous. The Latin Kings counted somewhere around 10,000 members in the state of Illinois alone, before you even account for the branches in other states. Zambrano sat at the top of all of it. The activities he presided over centered on the drug trade, but extended well beyond it, into a whole range of crimes designed to preserve and expand the organization's power, territory, and income. To protect their turf and their business, the organization used violence as a tool, including killings, attempted killings, beatings, and threats. One particularly revealing detail about how the organization operated involved the way it preyed on others in its own neighborhood. In Little Village, there were people who illegally sold false identification documents. The Latin Kings, under their leadership, forced these document sellers to pay what was essentially a tax, a regular payment demanded in exchange for being allowed to operate on the organization's turf. If the sellers did not pay, they faced threats and actual violence. This practice, demanding payment from others operating on your territory under threat of harm, is a classic feature of how these large street organizations sustained themselves. They did not just sell product. They taxed and controlled the entire underground economy of the areas they dominated, taking a cut of everything that moved through their turf and punishing anyone who refused to pay up. The violence the organization used was real and devastating, and it fell heavily on young people. Prosecutors described how, under the leadership of figures like Zambrano and those beneath him, the organization carried out a steady stream of shootings. In the little village area alone during the relevant period, there were hundreds of shootings connected to the organization's activities. One regional leader, who reported up to the top leadership, was described as having discussed dozens of shootings carried out by the members under him, even expressing a kind of pride at how consistent the violence was. And the people caught up in all of this, both as those carrying out the violence and as victims, were often very young. Prosecutors made a point that lands hard. Many of the soldiers the leaders were responsible for were simply boys, young people sent out to harm others, or to be harmed themselves, their lives spent or destroyed in service of the organization's power. This is one of the most tragic dimensions of these large street organizations, the way they consumed the youth of the communities they came from. Zambrano's particular role in all of this is important to understand correctly, because it reflects the same lesson we saw with the most successful crime bosses earlier in this story. Zambrano did not personally carry out the violence himself. He was insulated, operating behind the scenes, at the top of the structure. He set the direction and the policies, and he put leaders in place beneath him who shared his vision and who handled the actual brutality. Prosecutors described him as someone who chose violence at every turn, but who entrusted others to carry it out, deliberately keeping distance between himself and the bloody work being done in his name. This is the same insulation strategy that protected men like Tony Accardo decades earlier. The leader at the very top tries to keep his own hands clean, directing an organization that does terrible things while building layers of people between himself and any specific crime. It is a strategy designed to make the boss difficult to prosecute, because the soldiers who do the dirty work often cannot directly tie the man at the top to any single act. But that strategy, effective as it had been for earlier bosses, did not save Agustin Zambrano. The reason it failed comes down to a powerful legal tool that the government developed specifically to take down organized criminal enterprises, a tool that changed everything about how these cases could be prosecuted. This tool is a federal law commonly known by the abbreviation RICO, which stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. To explain it in the simplest possible terms, RICO was created to solve exactly the problem that insulated bosses like Zambrano and Accardo created. Under older laws, you generally had to prove that a specific person committed a specific crime. That made it hard to convict a boss who never personally pulled a trigger or carried a package. But RICO works differently. It allows the government to go after the leaders of a criminal organization by proving that they ran or participated in an ongoing criminal enterprise, an organization that committed a pattern of crimes over time. The genius of this approach, from the government's point of view, is that it lets prosecutors hold the leader responsible for the overall criminal operation, not just for crimes he personally committed with his own hands. If the government can prove that the organization existed, that it committed a pattern of criminal acts, and that the defendant helped run it, the leader can be convicted even if he was carefully insulated from the individual crimes. RICO was originally designed to fight the traditional organized crime families, the kind of Italian organizations that ran the outfit, and it proved devastatingly effective against them. But over the following decades, the government increasingly turned this same powerful tool against the large street organizations like the Latin Kings, treating them as the criminal enterprises they were, and using RICO to dismantle their entire leadership structures from the top down. That is exactly what happened to the Latin Kings. The government launched sustained, coordinated investigations involving multiple federal agencies working together with local police, all aimed at dismantling the hierarchy of the organization. These investigations stretched across years and produced waves of charges. In the mid-2000s, one investigation led to federal drug and weapons charges against dozens of members and associates. Another investigation a couple of years later produced charges against dozens more, including Zambrano himself and many of his co-defendants. In total, across these efforts, a very large number of Latin Kings members and associates faced state or federal charges, and a great many of them were convicted. The government was methodically working its way up the structure, building the sweeping case that would eventually reach the corona at the top. Zambrano was indicted along with a group of other top leaders. The case against him centered on the RICO charge, the accusation that he and his co-defendants ran a criminal enterprise centered on drug trafficking, using violence to protect their power and territory. The evidence presented at trial showed exactly how the organization functioned. It included audio and video recordings capturing beatings inflicted on members who had broken the organization's rules. It included testimony documenting the long string of shootings in the little village area. It laid out the written rules, the meetings, the initiation rituals, the extortion of the document sellers, the whole architecture of the criminal enterprise. A number of the people who had been part of the organization and had pleaded guilty agreed to cooperate and testified as witnesses against the leadership, providing inside accounts of how it all worked. After a lengthy trial, Agustin Zambrano was convicted. He was found guilty of the RICO conspiracy and the other charges against him. And then, in 2012, he was sentenced. The judge handed him 60 years in federal prison, which was the maximum sentence allowed under the law for what he had been convicted of. In imposing that maximum punishment, the judge pointed to Zambrano's extensive record of violent offenses and to his complete lack of any acceptance of responsibility or remorse for the victims of his organization. Because of the way federal sentencing works, he would be required to serve the vast majority of that sentence, meaning that for all practical purposes, the 60-year term ensured that the man who had been the crown over the entire organization would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Zambrano's conviction was a major blow to the organization, and it was notable for one particular reason. He was the highest-ranking leader of the Latin Kings to be convicted since another man, who had held the same title of Corona, had been sentenced to life in prison back in 2000 for running a continuing criminal enterprise. So within just over a decade, the government had managed to take down two of the top leaders to ever sit at the very peak of this organization. The crackdown on the Latin Kings showed how effective the sustained, patient application of the RICO law could be against even the most organized and structured of these street enterprises. The government was not just arresting street soldiers anymore, it was systematically decapitating the leadership, removing the men at the very top, one corona after another. The story of the Latin Kings and of Agustin Zambrano captures something essential about this whole era of Chicago crime. These organizations had become so large and so structured that they functioned almost like dark mirror images of legitimate institutions, with constitutions, hierarchies, and chains of command. But that very structure became their vulnerability. The same organized nature that made them powerful also made them targets for a legal tool specifically designed to attack organized criminal enterprises. By proving the existence of the enterprise and the pattern of its crimes, the government could reach all the way to the top, past all the layers of insulation that bosses had once used to protect themselves. The crown could no longer keep a leader safe. In fact, by the logic of RICO, sitting at the top of the structure was exactly what made a leader most exposed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The use of RICO against street organizations would keep shaping Chicago's underworld in the years that followed, reaching its most dramatic recent expression in a case that dragged on for years and only ended very recently. It involved a leader on the city's west side, a man who had survived being struck down himself and who fought the government through trial after trial. His name was Labar Span, and the street knew him as Bro Man. Section 10, Labar Span, Bro Man, and the Long Road to Justice. The use of the RICO law against Chicago's street organizations did not stop with the Latin Kings. It continued to shape the city's underworld for years afterward, and it reached its most dramatic recent conclusion in a case that dragged on for nearly a decade before finally ending. This case involved a leader from the west side of the city, a man who had survived being struck down by violence himself, who fought the government through one trial and then a second, and whose story shows that even in the most modern era, the old patterns from earlier in this tale were still alive. The insulation of the boss, the violence used to build a reputation, and the long reckoning that eventually came for him, all of it played out one more time in the case of Labar Spann, the man known on the street as Bro-Man. Labar Spann was a leader of an organization called the Four Corner Hustlers, a street group operating on the west side of Chicago. Federal prosecutors described the Four Corner Hustlers as a group of robbers, drug dealers, and people willing to kill, with a history of criminal activity stretching back to the mid-1990s. Spann came to be identified as a chief of this organization, though he would spend years insisting that he was not. The story of how the government built its case against him, and how that case nearly fell apart before finally succeeding, is one of the most revealing in this entire history, because it shows just how difficult it can be to bring down a careful and determined leader, even with all the tools the modern legal system has developed. A central and striking fact about Spann is that he was paralyzed. Back in 1999, he was struck down in a shooting, an attack that left him unable to walk for the rest of his life. From that point on, he used a wheelchair. This detail matters because it shaped how he was perceived and how he would later present himself in court. When prosecutors eventually put him on trial, they warned the jury not to be fooled by his physical condition, insisting that despite being in a wheelchair, the man in front of them was responsible for ordering deadly violence. A prosecutor told the jury plainly that the defendant sitting before them was someone who killed. Spann's paralysis became part of the strange texture of his case, a leader who directed violence from a wheelchair, who could not physically carry out the acts he was accused of orchestrating, which only reinforced how much his power, like that of the bosses before him, rested on directing others rather than acting himself. For a long time, Spann managed to avoid serious punishment, despite being a focus of law enforcement attention for the better part of 20 years. He was watched closely by police across many years. He was suspected in connection with numerous killings. At various points he pleaded guilty to certain crimes, including armed robbery and tampering with witnesses, and he was held in jail for an extended period. Yet records indicate that even while behind bars awaiting the resolution of his cases, he maintained a key role in the organization's operations. For 2 decades, through investigations and arrests, he largely avoided ending up in prison for the most serious accusations against him. He was, in the language used to describe the most insulated bosses, a difficult target, someone the authorities believed was responsible for terrible things but struggled for years to convict on the gravest charges. What finally allowed the government to mount its strongest case was the same powerful tool that had brought down the Latin King's leadership, the RICO law. In 2017, a sweeping racketeering indictment was brought against Spann and others connected to the Four Corner Hustlers. The indictment tied Spann to a series of killings, treating them not as isolated acts but as part of the pattern of criminal activity carried out by the organization he was accused of leading. This is exactly the power of RICO that we explored earlier. Rather than having to win separate cases for each individual crime, the government could bundle the whole pattern of the enterprise's activity together and hold the leader responsible for directing it. The case connected Spann to multiple murders committed over a span of years in the early 2000s, including the killings of rival figures and people the organization wanted out of the way. The specific killings at the heart of the case revealed the cold logic of how the organization operated. Prosecutors said Spann was responsible for 4 murders in particular. One victim was targeted because he had cooperated with law enforcement against Spann's father. Another killing grew out of a dispute between Spann and a rival in the drug trade. A third was described as a murder carried out for payment, with Spann delegating the actual act to loyal members of his organization who walked up to the victim and shot him. And perhaps the most notable of all was the killing of a rival organization's leader, a chief of the Latin Kings, for which prosecutors said Spann had been offered a payment of $20,000, sending someone to carry out the act while the victim was getting a haircut. That particular killing was significant enough that it had even been referenced in a song by a well-known rapper years earlier. Each of these killings, prosecutors argued, was committed at Spann's direction, the work of a leader using violence to protect his power, settle disputes, eliminate threats, and build his fearsome reputation on the West Side. In 2021, after a lengthy trial, a federal jury convicted Spann. He was found guilty of the racketeering conspiracy and related charges, and the jury held him responsible for the killings. Because of the nature of the charges, the conviction meant he faced a mandatory life sentence. After 2 decades as a target, it appeared that the government had finally succeeded in bringing him down for good. But the story was far from over, and what happened next is one of the most unusual twists in any case in this entire history. The conviction did not hold. The 2021 conviction was undone because of a serious problem with how the government had handled a key witness. It came to light that a former prosecutor in the case had made an unauthorized promise to an important witness, a promise the prosecutor was not allowed to make, and that this had tainted the process. Specifically, an investigation involving extensive interviews and the review of thousands of documents confirmed that the former prosecutor had improperly promised a key witness a particular outcome and had then elicited false testimony. This kind of misconduct strikes at the heart of a fair trial, because the justice system depends on witnesses testifying truthfully and on prosecutors playing by the rules. When the problem was uncovered, the situation was so serious that the government itself agreed that Spann deserved a new trial. The judge overseeing the case described the errors involved as deeply troubling and avoidable, and noted what a disservice the situation was to the victims and their families, who would now have to endure the ordeal of another trial. So the case had to be done all over again. Spann's first conviction was thrown out, and the entire matter went back to court for a second trial. This is a remarkable thing to consider. A man convicted of orchestrating multiple killings, facing a mandatory life sentence, had that conviction undone, not because he was innocent, but because the government had made a serious mistake in how it built its case. It is a reminder that the legal system holds the prosecution to strict standards, and that even in a case involving the most serious crimes, those standards cannot be ignored. For the families of the victims, it meant reliving the painful process. For Spann, it meant another chance to fight the charges against him. The second trial took place in late 2025, stretching over about 6 weeks. Once again, prosecutors laid out their case that Spann and his organization had terrorized the West Side for decades. Once again, they presented the evidence tying him to the 4 killings. And this time, Spann took an active role in his own defense, testifying on his own behalf. From the witness stand, he continued to deny everything. He insisted that he had nothing to do with the Four Corner Hustlers, claiming he operated as his own man, and even disputing the very idea that the organization had a chief at all. His defense attorneys argued that the government's case rested on the testimony of unreliable witnesses, people they characterized as liars who simply wanted to see Spann go to prison. But in December of 2025, the jury reached its verdict, and for the second time, they convicted Labar Spann of racketeering conspiracy and related crimes, again holding him responsible for the 4 murders. The deliberations this time were notably quick. The final chapter came in April of 2026, when Spann was sentenced. The judge handed down a life sentence, the punishment required by law given the convictions. The judge spoke directly to Spann, telling him that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, that he would take his final breath behind bars, and that nothing could bring back the people who had been killed. The judge also made a pointed observation about the senselessness of it all, suggesting that the entire reason for the violence had been so that Spann could be feared, so that he could be known by his street name and command the dread of others, presiding over an organization the judge dismissed in harsh terms. Even at the sentencing, Spann remained defiant, reacting with a laugh at one point, and signaling that he intended to keep challenging his conviction. After nearly a decade of legal battles, including a conviction that was overturned and a complete second trial, the case finally reached its end, with the leader of the Four Corner Hustlers set to remain in custody for the rest of his life. The case of Labar Spann brings this part of the story into the present day, and it shows how the patterns we have traced across a century of Chicago crime are still playing out. Like the most careful bosses before him, Span was insulated, directing violence rather than carrying it out himself, which is part of what made him so hard to convict for so long. Like the Latin King's leadership, he was ultimately brought down by the RICO law, the tool that allows the government to hold a leader responsible for the entire pattern of an organization's crimes. And like so many figures in this history, his power was built on violence used to create fear, on the willingness to eliminate rivals and enemies to protect his position. His story is a modern echo of everything that came before, proof that the fundamental dynamics of these organizations and the methods used to fight them have remained strikingly consistent even as the decades have passed and the faces have changed. But Span's case also adds something the others did not, a glimpse into the messy, imperfect reality of how justice actually gets done. His overturned conviction and second trial remind us that the process is not clean or simple, that mistakes happen, that the system must hold itself to its own rules even when pursuing the most dangerous people, and that the road to a final reckoning can be long, winding, and full of setbacks. It took nearly 20 years of investigation and nearly a decade of courtroom battles to finally close the book on Broman. That difficulty is itself a lesson about the stubborn, enduring challenge these organizations and their leaders have always posed. Across all 10 of these stories, from the Prohibition-era boss who built an empire on illegal alcohol to the wheelchair-bound street leader convicted only recently, the same threads keep surfacing. The bosses who lasted longest were the ones who stayed out of sight and kept their hands clean, while the ones who chased fame or grew careless were the ones who fell hardest. Power in this world was almost always built on fear, held together by money, and eventually broken by the slow, patient work of investigators who simply refused to stop. The faces changed across the decades, the neighborhoods changed, the product changed, but the shape of it stayed remarkably the same. And maybe that is the most sobering takeaway of all, that these were not 10 isolated stories but 10 versions of the same story, repeating itself over and over in a city that never quite managed to outrun it. The names you have heard today are the ones who rose high enough to be remembered. Countless others did not, and the streets that produced all of them are still there, still waiting to see who comes next. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.